Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is at the COP28 conference in Dubai. A big promotional item she's pitching are the new tax incentives for carbon capture and storage. Alberta's grants will cover up to 12% of the capital costs. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, it'll cost the province around $5.3 billion, but what will the return on investment be?
Yeah, the government is hoping, I think, for about $35 billion in investment in these projects. So carbon capture and storage is it's a really integral part of the province's emissions reductions plans. Obviously, we have a substantial oil and gas sector, and there pretty much isn't going to be a way to sort of get to net zero or dramatically reduce emissions without carbon capture and storage. So the purpose of this tax incentive, this grant, is to, sort of lure some of this investment to the province, build some of these facilities, upgrade some of the technology, those sorts of things. Now, I believe it is going to be coupled as well with a federal tax incentive of some sort on the same sort of front. The government of Alberta and the federal government had been talking about this, and the feds wanted Alberta to get involved in that sort of thing. But this is sort of the keystone item, I would say, that Premier Danielle Smith is bringing with her to the COP conference. Part of her purpose for being there is really to try and drum up investment in Alberta, try and convince maybe some Middle Eastern oil barons, I guess, to put some money into Alberta. So this is one of the big sales items she's going to have there to try and attract some of that investment. So we will see, I guess, if that pays off for her in the short term.
Now, the federal government has been hinting about an emissions cap on the oil and gas sector at COP. What kind of a pushback, Tyler, do you think we'll see from the provincial government? I mean, the Trudeau government already has 2 recent court losses under their belt, so I guess maybe they'll be a little more cautious about legislating these sorts of things?
Well, it's important that you brought up the 2 court cases, because for a long time, the Alberta government had a losing record when it was coming to fighting these sorts of things in court. They lost the carbon tax challenge in 2021. And I think to some extent, the federal government saw that victory and thought, aha, we're on the right track, we're on safe constitutional ground here. And then they went ahead with some of their other measures, Bill C-69, which turned into the Impact Assessment Act, and the plastics ban. And so those are the 2 items that the federal government has recently had trouble with in court. They lost at the Supreme Court on the Impact Assessment Act, which basically overhauled the approval of infrastructure projects, including pipelines. And they lost at the federal court on the plastics ban, on a piece of the plastics ban, I suppose is more accurate. But anyways, Stephen Guilbeault, the federal environment minister, said last week that part of the reason why the emissions cap has been sort of so long coming, a little bit delayed, is because of these 2 court decisions, and they need to really make sure that they are on firmer constitutional ground if they're going to go ahead with it. Now, by no means is that going to stop the Alberta government from saying that this is an unconstitutional infringement on Alberta's right to regulate its natural resources. It's, I think, going to be a massive fight. It's certainly going to be a big fight politically from the bully pulpit. There's going to be a lot of outrage, I think, similar to sort of what we've seen with Bill C-69 with the carbon tax. And I would expect there to be a court challenge to it in some fashion sometime down the road. But of course, those take time. You don't get a court hearing, the day after something's announced. But yes, there's, I think, going to be a significant political reaction. I think there's also going to be a fairly significant reaction from industry. And the reason I say that is because given the sort of size of the Alberta oil and gas industry, and given the size of the emissions from that industry, there's really likely no way, I should say, to stay within the emissions cap without curtailing production in some fashion. And so the estimates really vary there on how much production might have to be capped. It could be 600,000 barrels a day. It could be 1.3 million barrels a day. Those are sort of the 2 estimates that have come out in recent months and years. But all of this is also speculation because the cap hasn't been released. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know what loopholes there's going to be. We don't know if there's going to be some sort of trading carbon credit system built into it. So really very light on details, but that is supposed to be coming during the COP conference. And when it does, I have no doubt that this will be sort of the next great frontier in difficult relations between Alberta and Ottawa.
Tyler, the province was also up in arms over the federal government's new methane regulations. Now, given, as you mentioned, the plastics ban and the court rulings on the Impact Assessment Act, government officials here in the province are happy to argue that these types of policies are simply unconstitutional.
Absolutely. I think Alberta, because of those two victories, now has sort of I don't want to say a moral leg to stand on. That's not quite right. A legal leg to stand on. They have this bit of jurisprudence where they can say, actually, the courts are maybe on our side on some of these things. It changes the texture, I think, a little bit of the conversation. It's not the way that it was during the Jason Kenney years. It's not the same as the discussion about the carbon tax. There have been some of these federal government policies that have been found to trample on Alberta's constitutional jurisdiction. Whether or not the methane emissions rules will fall into that category, I mean, we don't know because it hasn't been challenged in court. But certainly this, I think, has changed the way the Alberta government is able to approach these debates. And so the other thing about the methane regulations, which is, I think, relevant, is there's sort of the Alberta government's talking a little bit about safety, because there's two things essentially that the regulations do. The first one is to put in a ban on flaring, and the second is to plug methane emissions leaks at sites. And so the government is saying, this is not only unconstitutional, not only is interfering in provincial jurisdiction, but it's also dangerous policy. So and Danielle Smith and Rebecca Schultz, the environment minister, had a very, very fiery statement out earlier this week on that, saying that this was, just a way for Stephen Guilbeault to pad his post-politics resume and things like that. So certainly we're going to hear a lot more about this as well. But I think if an emissions cap comes down, I think that's probably still going to be the big one.
Now, Tyler, there's been some speculation among the media that Alberta NDP leader Rachel Notley will consider retiring from politics. What are you hearing right now?
Well, there's certainly chatter about it. I think it's a thing that people are talking about. People are wondering. She was asked about this sort of right after the election. She said she was thinking about her options, thinking about her future. She would let people know when she'd made up her mind. I think it's fair to say perhaps that she hasn't made up her mind yet. She certainly has not said publicly what she's going to do. But there is, I think, a little bit of jostling within the NDP. There are people thinking about who maybe is going to come next. There's certainly some talk about what a convention would look like, what the leadership race would look like. I think there hasn't been a leadership race with the NDP in maybe since 2014. There might have been something at that convention, but it's been a while. I mean, Notley's been essentially the face of the NDP for a very, very long time. And so the party is not only going to have the logistical aspects of this to deal with once she leaves, if she leaves, I should say, in terms of who's going to be running, what's the leadership race going to look like, when is it going to happen, but also then there's going to be a couple of years of brand rebuilding. This has been the Notley NDP for so long. It's going to need to become the whoever NDP by the time the next election rolls around. But so there's certainly, it's a topic of discussion. Absolutely. People are talking about it. People are thinking about it. None of that means she's retiring tomorrow or by the end of the year or something like that. We just don't know yet.
Yeah, until she's made a firm statement. I mean, it's all just speculation at this point in time. Tyler, the NDP, speaking of which, has been hosting a number of town halls across the province, getting input from Albertans on if we should pull out of the CPP and create the Alberta Pension Plan. It seems that a number of people are not in favor. Many seniors are saying, hey, leave our pensions alone. And Premier Smith has suggested that more study needs to be done and a referendum on the subject would need to be held.
Absolutely. And the big difference is that the NDP is holding in-person town halls on the CPP stuff, whereas the government did telephone town halls. They've got, I think Jim Dinning is running a panel that's looking into it. He's going to report back eventually. But the NDP, I think, has really capitalized on some of the concern about this and is holding town halls across the province. And the reason I think that's notable is that they were in Red Deer just a couple days ago and had a couple hundred people out. And Red Deer is not NDP country, generally speaking. But you did have a couple hundred people who are very, very concerned about this. As you said, quite often seniors who are, currently drawing on their CPP and are unsure about what the future might look like, or people nearing retirement who are banking on their CPP payments. So The NDP, I think, is, we've talked in the past about how effective of an opposition they've been for the past few years. They've really, really capitalized on a handful of issues that the government has taken on, rightly or wrongly, the coal moratorium being a really good example of that. And they're certainly putting a lot of effort into the pension plan stuff. And, whether that's going to pay off in some fashion, it's hard to say because, as you mentioned, this is going to go to a referendum at some point. But the NDP certainly is trying to gin up support for a no vote in that referendum, I would say.
Let's talk healthcare now for just a moment. Alberta Nurses Union is worried over threats of job cuts as collective bargaining looms. Tyler, the union says the province is making a bad situation worse in healthcare by threatening in 2 recent letters to cut and contract out nursing jobs.
So this is sort of linked to that shuffle of the healthcare system that was announced a few weeks ago. Basically, breaking the healthcare system into sort of 4 different units. Alberta Health Services, for example, would become responsible for a smaller piece of the pie, is sort of how it works. So there were these letters, and what the government is saying is, look, we're restructuring the healthcare system. We are contractually obligated to inform the nursing unions that there's going to be some shifts in how things are working. And so they need to notify the nurses that that's going to happen. The government insists that they are not looking to reduce frontline workers, that in fact they are hoping to hire frontline workers. But the nurses unions are saying, look, we got a letter very, very similar to this back in 2019, and it turned out the government wanted to cut 500 jobs. So, I think there's always the fear among nursing unions and it's the job of unions to some extent to worry about the jobs of their members. But there's a big disconnect, I guess is what I'm saying, between what the government is claiming they're doing here and what the nurses union is worried about. But certainly, that's playing into a lot of the fears that Albertans have about the healthcare system right now. We've just come out of a pandemic in the last year or so where we saw the system stretched very thin. People are struggling to get family doctors, and ER wait times are horrible, and, children's hospitals are overrun, all those things. So there's a lot of public concern, I think, about anything that the government's going to be doing that could risk making healthcare worse. And certainly the nurses are raising that as well, saying we're already at unsafe levels of staffing and that they don't want to see things get worse. So as I said, big disconnect. But I think the core reason for this has to do with this reform of the healthcare system and what's going to come next there.
Yeah, we need to build back better when it comes to our healthcare system. And like you said, more doctors and nurses are desperately needed. Tyler, we've talked about the Sovereignty Act in the past, and guess what? It finally happened. Premier Daniel Smith announced that it'll be used against the Trudeau government and their clean electricity regulations. Now, is this a matter of the province telling Ottawa to basically stay in your lane?
It is. It's telling Ottawa to stay in its lane and also saying that, look, this actually might be impossible in Alberta. And the government is raising fears that there could be real impacts to the electricity grid if by 2035, I should say, it needs to reach net zero. They've raised concerns about brownouts and blackouts and things like that. Maybe a little bit hard to say how true that will be, 12 years down the line. But they're basically saying that, look, this is going to be harmful to Albertans. This is going to be expensive. We don't support this. And so the way the Sovereignty Act is supposed to work is basically, in this instance, is going to allow public institutions, government employees, for example, to not cooperate with the federal government. So, what does that look like over the next 12 years? That's a little bit hard to say, but perhaps that would be the federal government looking for information about Alberta's electricity grid, setting up some sort of working group on it, and employees would therefore be able to not participate. It doesn't seem to affect the private sector, which is, I think, notable considering the entire electricity sector in Alberta, more or less, is private, I believe, with the exception, I think, of a couple municipal-owned utilities. So that's basically what it's going to do. Now, the thing that is interesting about it is almost everything that the government announced when they brought up the Sovereignty Act, they could have actually done without the Sovereignty Act. So to some extent, this is largely symbolic. And I don't mean that as a pejorative necessarily, but this is a way to raise awareness of Alberta's concerns. Obviously, there were headlines across the country in a way that there might not have been if the Sovereignty Act hadn't been used. But I think the on the ground effects, the practical effects this is going to have remain a little bit unclear, frankly. But of course, this is the first time it's been used. So those things probably will become a little bit clearer in the months and years ahead.
Now, the other thing that came out of the Sovereignty Act announcement, Tyler, was that the province is considering creating a public utility company. What would that potentially look like?
Well, yeah. So Alberta mostly, as I said, has a private electricity market, and so the government is exploring the idea of creating a public electricity company, which is obviously a little bit odd for a free marketeer like Danielle Smith and a conservative government. But Smith said basically, if it happens, it would be something like Alberta Treasury branches. It would operate within the larger private market. And it seems to be the idea is that this would be sort of a generator of last resort. If by 2035 there's big problems with the electricity grid, there's projects that can't get financed or are going to close down or something, this public company could step in and purchase them or run them. I think we're a long ways away from seeing that, frankly. They essentially announced that they're going to look into it to see whether or not it's a good idea or a feasible option. So it's not like we're going to have the Alberta Electricity Corporation or something pop up in the next couple months and offer discounted electricity, but certainly an interesting wrinkle and a very practical step, I guess, compared to some of the other stuff in the Sovereignty Act motion.
The NDP introduced a bill that would see rent control come to our province. Rents in many cities are simply out of control right now. I talked to a lot of my family, and it's unbelievable, especially in Calgary and Edmonton. It would cap rent increases at 2% for 2 years, and then it would be linked to the Consumer Price Index for, 3 years?
Yeah, 3 years, and then it could never actually go above 5%. So, if you had a high inflation year of 7% inflation or something like that, it would still be capped at 5. This is frankly, I think, unlikely to go anywhere. I don't think the UCP is going to be in favor of rent control. But certainly, this is a little bit like the CPP thing. The NDP has noticed that there is this big issue right now, this thing that is causing a lot of concern to Albertans: affordability, rental prices, housing prices, all that, and they've got a policy proposal for it. So I think there's probably going to be some debate on it. Certainly there's going to be some headlines. There's going to be, it's a long-term political game in some ways, right? They can say when the next election comes around or at any point in the next few years saying, look, we tried to get rent control in, we tried to bring down rental prices, and the UCP wouldn't let us do it. So there's the political strategy there as well, in addition to, they probably genuinely do think this will help rental prices for Albertans. So I think unlikely to go anywhere, but certainly an example of the NDP working to be an effective opposition.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post. Tyler Dawson, thanks again for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.